Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome to Reinventing Parking. I'm your host, Paul Barter. This time, I'll be talking with three people from the Parking Reform Network about PRN's efforts to map the off-street land devoted to parking in a large number of American central city areas or downtowns. The resulting maps were released earlier in 2023, and they've attracted quite a lot of media and other attention. If you want to take a look, they are under the resources section of the PRN website, parkingreform.org. So to talk about it, we have Tony Jordan, President of the Parking Reform Network and a regular on this show. Also, Etienne Lefebvre, who is PRN's Communications Coordinator, and Thomas Carpenito, who was the initiator of this mapping project and its volunteer coordinator. Hi guys, welcome to Reinventing Parking.
Thanks for having us on, Paul.
Tom, in a nutshell, what are these downtown parking lot maps all about?
So it's a visualization resource that we've developed kind of to show all the land that's used up in our most valuable parts of our city. So our downtowns, our financial districts, our city centers, that's only devoted to parking. So this is going to be surface lots and garages. This won't include anything like underground or podium parking that has more than one use. So this is all the land that's really just being devoted to only one thing.
Okay. In the reactions, you had some quibbles, people nitpicking a little bit, why not podiums? Why not this? So there's a rationale there. It's the land that's 100% devoted to parking, and it's the off-street. The on-street is not included. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And how many cities are included so far?
So we have around 50 right now. We're planning to add another 20 in the next week or two. So we're going to have all cities over 300,000. So all the major cities in the United States. Any
plans to go beyond the United States?
Yeah, I need a super volunteer from Canada or other country that's willing to spearhead this. There's just so many cities in the United States that are really, really bad for this sort of land use. So we thought best to highlight the U.S. first.
For various reasons, you've zeroed in on central city areas or downtowns. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the biggest bang for your buck with parking reform is going to be transit-rich, and walkable neighborhoods. So that's the area we want to focus on. Cities that have upwards of 20 to 30% of their land devoted to parking have a really easy resource that they should be utilizing. And that's what we're trying to point out here.
Yeah. Were there also practical reasons, just that this is a lot of work to generate these maps? To some extent, there's some automation, but you need to check. So this is not a trivial task, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of work. We're seeing that all the cities that have low metro areas, so we're talking about Wichita, Kansas, Greensboro, North Carolina, really don't have any parking mapped in OpenStreetMaps, so we're doing this all by hand for all those lesser known cities.
And you alluded there that there's a resource behind the scenes, the data in OpenStreetMap, and you need that to be reasonably robust to make a start.
Yeah, well, it certainly helps. When it's not complete, we don't have that resource. It takes a long time. So to add the 50 cities, it took a few months. Now to add the remaining 20 smaller metro areas of 300,000 and up in the city center, it's taking a much longer time. Definitely more difficult without OpenStreetMaps.
So what gave you the idea to do this, Tom?
I came up with the idea because there's no resource really to measure how much of our land is devoted to parking. Tony says this often, that cities don't even know how much parking they actually have. So if we want to really communicate that parking is an issue for walkability, housing, and urban issues, it really helps to have those numbers on it.
Over the years, people have done this in an ad hoc way, haven't they? Like in 2017, I think it was Nate Hood in Minneapolis or St. Paul mapped the downtown parking, and that was a very kind of a powerful thing, but only for one city. And Edmonton, during its big debate about parking mandates, some of the activists there mapped parking in their downtown in a similar way. But the special thing about this exercise that now has been taken on by Parking Reform Network is the sheer ambition of it, right? It's quite an audacious thing to try to get so many cities in one set of maps. Maybe that's a good moment to bring in Etienne or Tony to talk about how did PRN get involved?
Tom became a member of the organization, I believe, and then reached out to me on the Slack. I believe he heard about it after City Nerd made that video about us back in the end of the year, in December of 2022. And Tom showed up and said he'd been working on this project and showed me a link to the Google Maps he had. And I was immediately just very excited about it. As you mentioned, I have an image that I used in a slide deck back in 2015, 2016 that was of Little Rock. I think there was an image that everyone was using that was just like every now and then someone would make one of these images with the red boxes showing the downtowns, but they weren't standardized or in any particular one place. And I think that one of the really powerful things about what Thomas was doing was looking at a number of cities and putting them all in one place. And also when he brought them to Parking Reform Network, we were able to platform them in a way that tied them to some activity, to something to do about it, to some further messaging. So it's not just a tweet or it's not just an Instagram post.
And that reminds us, please do join Parking Reform Network if you haven't. No matter where you are in the world, you're welcome. The Parking Map project, this is just one of several Parking Map projects, in fact, and we have various other projects. There are plenty of volunteer activities that you can dive into and get very actively involved. Maybe Etienne can say something about that.
Bring us your projects.
Yeah, exactly. One of our first projects was we call it our mandates map. It's a map we have that's open source where users from individual cities can submit reports. And it's a way of tracking which cities has either removed or reduced the parking mandate, so minimum parking requirements that cities have usually in their zoning codes. The idea also behind the parking lot map is that it's a continuation of the mandates map. The mandates map, it showcases the first step that cities have to do. You have to let builders build the amount of parking that they think is required rather than imposing an artificially high amount. And so the parking lot map is kind of it's a wow factor visualization of like, wow, look at all the space that we have. Look at all the potential we have to really make our cities more livable, more walkable, more in line with the challenges we face with the climate crisis, for example. So many people go about their lives without understanding the massive cost that car infrastructure imposes on the society as a whole, right? And so when someone sees a map that 30% of the surface area in their city is dedicated to the storage of cars, where, for example, it might only be in use for, 30% of the day, and then the rest is just empty, that's a big issue that most people overlook.
Let's follow up, Etienne. You're communications director, and you've been on the front line of people reacting to this, and also you've been pivotal in terms of making people aware of this exercise and the maps. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Was it difficult to get people's attention, or was there a huge reaction sort of more or less instantly?
I was surprised myself, and I had high expectations that we were going to be able to really get through in the media, but it went above my expectations. So when I joined in January, and the task I set myself was really helping out build our membership with our weekly newsletter. And I would make sure to engage the community and make sure that for example, our monthly organizing roundtable was well attended. And throughout that process, especially with the development of the parking lot map, we received a lot more media attention than I was anticipating. So we were featured, for example, in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it really snowballed from there. And we could really feel in the air that there was such interest in urbanism, in active transportation, and in curbside management, which is where we come in, right? How do we best manage this abundant supply of parking that we have, and how do we manage it in a way that creates more interesting places to live rather than, these non-places and desolate places like massive stroads or empty parking lots with, shopping carts thrown around, right? How do we create a vibrancy in community? I think that really resonated across both the United States and Canada.
Were there any particular cities where the media was especially interested and it made a big splash?
Tony, do you have an example of a city?
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the great things about when this map started going kind of viral was Axios started picking it up and did a number of articles about a lot of the cities. And what was great was that in a few cities like Detroit and Atlanta and in Austin, the local media and other cities picked this up as well. But in those three cities in particular, the local media picked it up and then reached out to people who happen to be in our network already and did additional interviews with them, either podcasts or local news stories. So as far as like the Parking Reform Network being about really an activism organization and helping people to take action locally in their city, these maps were great because they actually touched off a conversation that then highlighted local efforts. It was fantastic to see some of our local advocates and members getting airtime because of these maps.
I remember the Seattle City Director for Urban Planning also shared our maps. And there's a lot of similar examples of that. Without even our intent of sharing it to specific cities, it really spread naturally and organically throughout both the social media environments and the traditional news media.
Maybe that's a good moment to also talk about people starting to use the maps for other purposes.
I did want to say one of the coolest things that we saw someone do with this data was because we try to release them in open data ways, Creative Commons or under open source licenses, a number of places have taken some of this data and reworked it. So an artist, Mike McCubbin's Civic Design, I believe, or Civic Graphics, I think is his company. He made just for himself an image in the style of the old national park posters that was like, welcome to the national parking lot of St. Louis. He's from St. Louis. And Streets Blog saw that on his Instagram and commissioned a number of other posters of similar styles. That went pretty viral for a little while. And we're actually in the process of getting some actual postcard style format of those graphics printed up. And that was great too, because we commissioned Mike to make our more graphic parking map. So how these things kind of pile up, it's like Thomas shows up after watching this video, he joins, he brings this project to us. Next thing you know, we've got this graphic designer making some stuff on their own. Other organizations are commissioning art based on it. It really just goes to show kind of how this network snowballs.
Okay, let's get back to some basics about what really is the problem here. So again, why is it a bad thing if there's a lot of land devoted to parking in the center of a city? There's various reasons that you've already mentioned, but let's dig just a little bit deeper. Why is this both a real problem and then perhaps an opportunity? Maybe Tony could lead off on that one.
We often talk about, Choop, I think, has said, and we hear from other reformers, parking is kind of like this dark matter of the urban landscape, right? It pushes everything apart. So these empty spaces, in addition to the environmental impacts they have, heating and water runoff, are also places that, spread everything apart. And it's really in these central cities that we should be having housing and mixed use spaces. It doesn't change overnight. You have to do a lot of other things to get these parcels to redevelop. It's more than just getting rid of your mandates, of course. But there is tremendous potential in these spots.
Some people will say, "Oh, well, the market has spoken. This is market forces. This is preferences. People want to drive. They want to park conveniently near their office downtown or where they're going shopping downtown." Who are you to argue against people's preferences? Is this just the market speaking, or is there more going on here?
Well, if I could speak to that, for the last 100 years, we've had a distorted market where the government has mandated many types of car-dependent infrastructure that has, in effect, created a subsidy for drivers. And so in such a distorted market, it's very difficult to speak about the fair preference between, for example, choosing to drive and not choosing. I think we should strive towards a world where we can really talk about the preferences of people in a fair market, but we're nowhere close to there. And I think a lot of the things we're advocating for is really trying to get us there, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, sometimes people ask us, are we anti-car? Well, to the extent that we want cars to pay their way and not be subsidized and not be artificially socially engineered to be excessively used, then maybe you would call us anti-car. But to me, that doesn't sound anti-car. That just sounds like, leveling the playing field. And I'm glad you mentioned that enormous kind of edifice of social engineering in favor of car-based planning and development, because I was going to zero in on the parking part, which is several things. One is, in the US cities, the whole urban renewal program systematically decimated inner city neighborhoods and demolished buildings, and there were all these vacant lots, and then an additional distortion, which is not any kind of natural market phenomenon, but a distortion in the tax system. The taxation is based on the property investment rather than the land, mostly in most cities. And so keeping land vacant and using it for parking is weirdly profitable for a surprisingly long time. And so that's land banking, but it's land banking distorted by this enormous tax kind of subsidy, which again is another hidden subsidy for parking and driving, which people just don't know about. They're not aware of it. Tony, did you have something to add?
I just did want to add that it's, when we talk about those mandates and we think about why it's so hard for these places to redevelop, I mentioned that there's not usually parking mandates in these central city areas if there's supposed to be new housing. But when you are requiring parking in all the less dense housing around a city center, that means we're kind of propping up that demand to have those things remain as parking in the central city.
I'm glad you mentioned parking mandates, because we should have mentioned them as one of the causes. Even though many central cities have abolished parking mandates relatively recently, many of them did have parking mandates all through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and it was not the only cause of demolitions and surface parking lots, but it was one of them.
One of the craziest things we've noticed is when Thomas did his map of Portland, right? It's like 11 or 12% parking in Portland, which is supposed to be a city that's got pretty good transportation. We have another parking reform network researcher, Ryan Martin, who did a map of the entire city of Portland, the whole city boundaries. And something like 20% of the city of Portland is surface parking. He didn't even really do the garages. So that indicates that the downtown, and I think this is probably bears out in a lot of these cities, the downtown is to a degree for commercial center the best case scenario. If your downtown is 25% parking, what is your more recent commercial space look like? It's probably 40 or 50% parking. And so when you've got that situation, it's very hard to untangle and reuse that space downtown because it's locking in car dependency outside of your central city. Thomas?
So the parking requirements are definitely a piece of the puzzle. It totally depends on the city as well. Cities that grew a lot after World War II, parking requirements are a really big thing that influences them. In older cities, urban renewal is a big part of it, and as well like land banking, like you said.
I've been involved in data compilations about cities in the past, and one of the frustrations is you spend hours, weeks, months getting things right, avoiding errors, correcting errors, and then when you release these things, you get a lot of very glib nitpicking quibbles with little things or misunderstandings, and it's a little frustrating, but it's understandable, right? People are coming at this and they don't know all that background, and it's hard to explain all that background. So maybe can you address one or two of the most obvious quibbles and nitpicks, just so we can clear those up for anyone who's listening?
Tony knows about one of our biggest nitpicks. This is my bad. So in Detroit, there is a convention center that has, very clear parking lot on top of the convention center. I mapped it in, and probably everyone in Detroit, as well as their relatives, messaged us that we mapped the convention center. They were very angry. We removed it, and, it's still a lot of parking in Detroit. So the point was a moot, but that happens a lot. We also get a ton of requests to do podium parking and underground parking. One of the problems with that is we have no idea who has underground parking and who doesn't. We do this all based on satellite imagery.
It's an irony that about half the people are complaining that we're not counting enough parking, and then half the people are complaining that we counted too much parking. So I think we're probably hitting a good spot there. And it's hard to do this. People also complain because something new was built in a place on top of a parking lot. So they're mad that Thomas hasn't actually gone out and verified the location personally. There's a lot of boundary complaints that, why did you do it here versus there? But ultimately, it's, this isn't a life or death situation specifically for showing these maps. We're proving a point which I think holds.
And one of the best objections is, why haven't you mapped my city? And to which your answer is always, oh, we would love to. Would you like to volunteer and please join the Parking Reform Network and come in and help us out?
That's usually the response. Either that or we're on it. A lot of people like to recommend their really small towns, but we always try to help people, whoever wants to make their own maps, we help them out.
Does it take a lot of technical expertise to use the GIS software and the open data stuff?
No, it just takes time. It just takes time. I mean, you could do a city of 100,000 in an hour or two.
Okay. So listeners, if you're interested, if you want your city included, even if it's outside the US, get in touch and we will help you out to do it and join the network. Okay. Many of these cities have all of this land devoted to parking in their central cities. What can those cities do to do better?
Yeah, there's tons of examples of cities that have been, completely leveled. Portland, Maine, completely leveled by fires. Chicago, Illinois as well. And within a decade or two, most of their city was rebuilt. So when we get rid of all of these regulations regarding building, how things are built, how high they have to be, how much parking they need, and you get out of the way of developers who want to, add this type of housing, add these type of buildings, you find that, when there's a demand and investment that, things like this happen really fast. And great examples of this are Seattle, where you could literally look at the satellite map in I think it's the Denny Triangle neighborhood, where overnight it was around 40% parking, and now it's only around 10. It's a night and day situation.
That's an excellent point. We should acknowledge that the peak of land devoted to parking was in the past, right? Probably the 70s or 80s, maybe. And so that's even more striking is the results that we've got in these maps. This is not even the worst of it.
I think also when we talk about these reforms, cities should, once again, not just focus on their downtowns, though. Don't just try to fix it for these large lots downtown, but allow new development outside of the central city to not be car dependent, right? Someday, hopefully, with the help of AI or other things, we're going to have broader maps that show what's going on outside of these city centers. And you'll see, there's still a lot of potential for mixed-use development in a lot of other places. And if we can reduce car ownership and car dependency in those places, that will create that tremendous demand that makes those very high-value parcels redevelop. That is one piece here that is these central city pieces. A lot of times the land is so valuable that there's a very high trigger price. Usually you're not going to redevelop your central city parking lot with just some low-rise buildings.
Yeah, I had a list of various things. One of them was a Montreal-style surface parking tax or levy. Abolishing parking mandates, of course, is a key step. I learned recently that some cities are starting to ban new surface parking lots. For example, Gainesville, Florida has done that, and or above a certain size at least. Oregon is going to set surface parking maximums in certain cities. And yeah, cities have this land bank, and there's various things they can do to encourage development and redevelopment of that land bank. Tony.
Most surface lots were built before there was much landscaping or water management. So a lot of these surface lots, they don't have trees in them. The runoff is coming right off the lot and going into the central sewer or onto the streets. If you could require, or like what France is doing, requiring large surface lots to have solar panels on top of them, or require that water runoff. So that might encourage some redevelopment, because then the landowner has to put in some money into the lot, and that might tip the scales for them to build it into something different. There's a little bit of a double-edged sword when you do this. If they do invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into retrofitting their surface lot, it's probably going to stick around for at least a couple more decades until they get that investment back. Shared parking also, Paul, one of your favorite things, right, is a good way to retrofit at least some of the structured parking, because that's not going to go away anytime soon. And so if you legalize the shared use of that or incentivize shared use, then that can reduce the demand for the surface lots nearby and hopefully spur redevelopment.
Okay, some people are hearing about parking being redeveloped, built on, they'll be saying this is only going to make it worse. So one answer is that actually most of these downtowns don't have a shortage. They have an enormous glut. The map alludes to that, but one of the reasons why it seems like there's a shortage is partly because people are searching for free parking, and not all of it's free. But secondly, a lot of that parking is not open to the public. The shortage is really not a problem for the foreseeable future in somewhere like Buffalo or Detroit, right? Some of that private parking will become shared. Some of that shared parking will be opened to the public. Some of it will turn into garage or underground parking at some point. Some of it will be priced more efficiently. The on-street will get managed better. There's just 99 things that the landowners, the property owners, and the city can do such that shortage is not going to be a problem. It's the glut that's the problem.
I live in an apartment building, and beside me 10 years ago, it was a surface parking lot, mainly for monthly passes for mostly commuters who worked in office buildings. And they redeveloped the surface parking lot. They built a grocery store basically on the podium level, and then two large 30-story towers. But underneath, they built like a 6-story underground parking lot. But the great part was that something like 20% of all the parking lots in the garage are reserved for a car share system. And so now today, I often go to that parking garage to use the car share system. And what that means, though, is that there's a lot of people like me and a lot of other people who live around who now utilize a parking space way more efficiently than if I had to, buy my own car and use my own parking space.
Let's end by just talking about what next for this project and for the three of you in relation to the project.
Thomas has mentioned that he's been working on an additional number of cities in the traditional way. There's a academic at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, his lab is working on using machine learning to kind of help find these lots. And actually, they're training their model with the maps that Thomas made and with the data that Ryan provided them from Portland. There's also some integration, I think, down the line, hopefully with our other map products, with the mandates map and with other advocacy tools that can tell more of a story around what's going on. And there has been interest in segmenting the lots versus the garages. Thomas, do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, so the lots versus garage is useful in the fact that surface lots are much more developable than garages. As for how time consuming that would be, I would say high. So it'd be very difficult, and then as well to reintegrate and remake the whole map would be very difficult.
Okay.
So that's not on particularly the top of the list. But yeah, expanding it to all cities over 300,000 to make it more uniform, that's number one. There's also another project that I'd be interested in, which is, Google Earth has a historical satellite image feature. So you could toggle all of these cities, what they looked like 20 years ago. Some cities changed a lot, have redeveloped a lot of parking. Some cities have added more parking. So what are the cities doing that are removing lots? What are the cities not doing that have a lot of lots? We could kind of shout out all of the cities that are doing really well and ask questions about the ones that aren't improving at all.
That's fantastic. Etienne?
I just want to speak a bit more about the AI project. So yeah, we are currently collaborating with Dr. Louis Leahy, and he's working with a team of graduate students. And the goal there is really to create an AI classification system that's able to do what our parking lot maps are, but very quickly and for large areas. So ideally, we would be aiming at around a 90% accuracy rate. And so the idea here is not to have a perfect accuracy, but it's really to showcase a large swath of lands, and you can have a rough estimate of how much parking. And so that would obviously be a very powerful tool.
Okay, thanks to the three of you. I'm sure the listeners will find that quite inspiring, that grassroots voluntary effort can result in a communication tool and a research tool that is so powerful and persuasive and important. So congratulations on the achievement so far, and we'll be looking forward to further developments.
Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. It was great.
Thanks, Paul.
You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.